everyone, and welcome back to Liz Sews and the next video in my Disney Bounding in the Bedroom series, where I create lingerie inspired by Disney characters of my youth. In today's video, we'll be going over the initial pattern alterations that I'm planning on making for this underbust corset that will be going along with my Ariel bra and panty set that I made last month. You can see here that I'm sketching in some things onto the style lines of this pattern because originally my thought was to have this as a gored corset, and so I wanted to see if that was an alteration that I could make myself to this already pre-existing pattern. Everything in today's video is actually shot back in December of 2020, as soon as I figured out that I wanted to start doing this project, and I just couldn't wait. I wanted to get started. Since then, I have changed my mind a little bit about the way that this corset is going to look, but I can go ahead and show you the details. So this is the Sonia underbust corset from Ariel Black, and I can go ahead and link this in the description box below. It is a free pattern. There's a fair number of instructions on how to measure yourself for this pattern, but there's not a lot of instructions on how to actually construct it. So there will be a video later on in this month where I go through the steps involved in creating this corset itself. So the first thing that I wanted to do was take all of my measurements in centimeters, and then I have to adjust my measurements before I can compare them to the chart. So for my full bust and under bust, as well as my high hip and hip measurement, I need to subtract 5 centimeters. That 5 centimeters will account for the 2-inch lacing gap that will be in the finished corset. And then for the waist, I actually am subtracting 15 centimeters. That allows for the 2-inch gap and lacing gap in the back, as well as a 2 to 4 inch waist reduction. I do want to see a little bit of a waist reduction in this because I have several corsets already in my collection, and I know that I'm pretty squishy around my midsection, so I can definitely cinch down for a full 4 inches. So once I have adjusted all of those measurements, I can go ahead and compare them to the measurement chart. So for my underbust, I was in between an F and a G. I decided to go up to a G because it's better to have it be slightly too big than slightly too small, I was assuming. So I've circled at the G. For the waist, I'm actually a size E, so 2 sizes smaller. And then for my hip measurement, I am back to a size G. So in this pattern, obviously, I am a little bit more curvaceous than it was originally designed for. So I'm gonna have to go ahead and grade in those different sizes between my waist and the rest of my body in order to get the right shape to fit myself. I could go with a straight size G, but what would happen is I would end up not getting that waist reduction that I really wanted. The next thing I need to look at is all of my distances. So the distances between my underbust and my waist and things like that, and checking off to make sure that I don't need to add any length to my corset anywhere else. So even though the pattern lists the distances between those different markers, sometimes I like to measure the actual physical pattern piece itself just to make sure. And in this case, I've decided I wanted to add 1 inch or 1 centimeter just below the waist in order to get a little bit longer distance between my waist and my hip. That was the only lengthening measurement that I needed to alter for my patterns. And even still, that 1 centimeter change means that I'm going to have to alter it on all 7 or 8 of my pattern pieces. So it's still quite time consuming. This allows me to get the corset exactly the length, the top to bottom that I need, as well as all of my width-wise measurements. So with the size determined, I can go ahead and start taping together my pattern pieces and making all of those alterations. So the first step of alterations is going ahead and taping my pattern pieces together. Most of these pattern pieces are longer than a single piece of paper, so they do require some taping to get everything aligned up, but it's not super difficult like most PDF garment patterns, just because it's only ever 2 pieces of paper that I'm taping together. So once I've done that, I've identified my hip line where it is I wanted to lengthen it by 1 centimeter, and I'm cutting directly across that hip line. That hip line should be at the same location on all of my pattern pieces, so they know that if I add the length there, it's adding equally along the entirety of the pattern itself. Once I have cut my pattern piece apart, I'm going to draw on a piece of paper 2 lines that are 1 centimeter apart and parallel, and that's going to be the way that I sort of lengthen my pattern piece along that hip line. And then all I have to do is tape both of my pattern pieces onto that scrap piece of paper with that centimeter addition added into it. So next I want to tackle the grading between sizes. So if you remember, I was a G at both the under bust and hip, but a size E at the waist. So I'm going to locate all of those marks and draw in a little dot with my Sharpie. There are a lot of lines here, so I want to make sure that I'm choosing the right one. So I draw in my line, I'm counting over to make sure I'm doing the right one. And then once I have all of those dots located at both the under bust, the waist, and the hip, I can go ahead and grade between them to get my variable sizing that I need for my particular shape. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is quite a time-consuming process, connecting all of those dots and redrawing each of my side seams, but it's well worth it because I get a pattern that looks and fits much better in the end. So I'm just going to go through and show you this single pattern piece first, but just know that I went ahead and repeated this for all 8 of the pattern pieces that go around this corset. Once I have all of my seam lines drawn in on my pattern pieces, I'm going to go ahead and add my seam allowances. So this pattern does not have any seam allowances included, which means you can go ahead and add whatever you want. So in my case, I'm going to be using my seam allowances as part of the structure of the channeling itself. So I'm adding 5/8 of an inch seam allowance along all of my vertical seams. I'm also adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the top and the bottom of the corset. I may or may not need this, but I would like to have a little bit extra fabric so that if it starts fraying, it's something that I can cut off. The top and bottom sides are going to be covered with binding, so technically they don't need any seam allowance at all, but I'm just adding a 1/4 inch as a safety net in case the fabric starts to fray. So this process is repeated for every single pattern piece, lengthening it by 1 centimeter, grading between those different sizes, and then adding seam allowances. So I've located piece number 2 and piece number 3. Those are the 2 panels that are going to be on the front of the corset. And what I've decided is I'm looking at my line drawing, trying to see like where it is I'm connecting to things. And I can see that I'm hitting right below the waist on piece number 3 and trying to decide where it's going to curve in. So a lot of times just drawing like this on your line drawing is super helpful because it helps you get an idea of where things should be hitting. I'm going to overlap these 2 pattern pieces along the seam lines. That way I have one continuous piece, and then I'm going to freehand in that sort of hip gore curve, moving from the waist across that panel 3 and cutting into panel 2. And the reason I'm overlapping these on top of each other using a light board is that way I know exactly that I will get one smooth continuous line, because that gore is going to be forming a 3rd piece altogether. So I'm just refining my curve a little bit here. I didn't like the initial curve I drew in, so I'm getting a different one. It's a little more curvy, and just making sure I have something that looks exactly the way I want it to. I'm gonna go ahead and put the panel 2 on top. That way I can continue that curve over on panel 2. Most of it got cut off because of the seam allowances, but I just want to make sure that I have something that is continuous, but moving between the 2 different panels. Once this gore style line is in place, I'm going to go ahead and cut apart all of my pattern pieces. So I'm cutting apart panel 2, and I'm going to cut apart panel 3, and the gores I will tape together, so I will have a single gore. Now that I've done that, I'm attaching some more paper so I can add my seam allowances on all of the portions of the pattern that I've cut. Like I said, I'm going to continue with the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, when attaching this gore piece here because I want to go ahead and put boning along that curve. So I'm using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so that the seam allowance of the couture fabric itself can be used as the channeling. I don't have to add any additional channeling for strength. So now it's just a matter of adding all of those seam allowances in on the 3 different pattern pieces. Okay, so the mock-up is done. I did not bother filming and making this just because this is literally the first corset I have ever made, and you guys didn't really need to see me fumbling around with it. So far, I think it's looking pretty good. I just used like leftover bits and bobs I had from like cheap costume corsets. So obviously I'm going to need to get a shorter busk to put in the front here. I was really worried about the busk, but, or like how difficult it was going to be, but it seems pretty straightforward. One thing I can tell just by looking at it now is that I think I want a little bit sharper of a point here in the center front. I really want something that sort of comes to a point in between the bust line, but I think the hip gore that I added worked really well. And I like the style lines. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop this on and see if I can tell anything else from it. Okay, so here it is on, and I actually quite like it a lot. Obviously I'm getting really good waist definition, which I like to see, and it's quite comfortable. I definitely have more than enough room up in the rib cage area, but it's not like, it's not too loose. It's just, it feels just right. Again, I do think I want to do more of a significant point here in the center front, just as an aesthetic choice. The back is less successful. I do have just a little bit of extra material in this hip gore here, but I think I'm going to remove that gore altogether and go back to the original pattern, which was like 2 vertical seamed panels. This gore was really difficult to sew in, and it doesn't fit great, so I think that's going to go. But I think I'm going to go ahead and keep the one that's in the center front here because the fit is looking nice, and I like the style lines of having everything sort of like coming down towards that center front section there. I have no lacing gap in the back, and I think that might be a function of the fact that I'm using twill for this mock-up instead of like a couture, which the final, of course, it's going to be having couture as the strength layer in it. So I'm not so much worried about the absence of the lacing gap, just because I think that once you're using sturdier fabric, that'll go away and I'll get my 2-inch lacing gap. But yeah, I think it looks really good. I'm definitely able to tight lace, or not necessarily tight lace, but get some very significant waist reduction in this, and it feels pretty comfortable. Like I can move around, I can do stuff in it. I don't feel like my breathing is being impacted in any way. So in terms of first testing on this, I am pretty happy with the result. I definitely think this is something I'm going to be able to do. I just need to sort of take my measurements for my busk here, fix the pattern in the back, increase the point on this section, and call it good. Yeah, so mock-up successful.